The docking bay of the Galactic Culinary Academy was a marvel of technology and alien design, a swirling hub of culinary students from across the galaxy arriving to prove their worth in the most prestigious cooking institution known to exist. Floating drones zipped overhead, scanning luggage and directing newcomers to their assigned living quarters. The air was thick with unfamiliar scents, some sweet and floral, others so pungent that James Carter had to resist the urge to gag. He took a deep breath, gripping the strap of his bag, and stepped forward. He was the first human to ever set foot in this place, and he could feel the weight of 1,000 skeptical eyes on him. A towering, multi-limbed Zelvari instructor stood at the entrance, his chitinous plates gleaming under the station's artificial light. Chef Gorath, the Academy's head instructor, was infamous for his brutal teaching style. His 4 primary arms were crossed as he observed the new arrivals, while 2 secondary arms casually diced something that looked alarmingly like it was still moving. The moment his compound eyes locked onto James, his mandibles clicked in irritation. "Human," he said, the word dripping with disdain. "I assume there has been an administrative error." James smiled, unfazed. "No error. I was accepted into the Academy." He handed over his acceptance documents, which a nearby drone scanned and confirmed with an affirmative beep. Gorath let out a low hiss, but motioned for James to enter. "This is a place for true culinary artistry," he muttered as James passed. "Not for species who burn animal flesh and drown it in salt." James chuckled. "You've clearly never had Texas barbecue," he said before stepping into the Academy halls. Inside, the grandeur of the Academy was overwhelming. Kitchens the size of stadiums stretched across multiple levels, filled with students of all shapes and sizes preparing dishes that steamed, bubbled, and glowed. Holographic recipe guides floated in midair, displaying ingredients that James had never seen before. Some students stirred massive vats with mechanical arms, while others delicately placed microscopic garnishes with surgical precision. Every species had a different way of cooking, but they all had one thing in common. None of them believed a human could compete at their level. James found his assigned station, a sleek cooking pod outfitted with tools he barely recognized. His presence had not gone unnoticed. A group of students nearby, a trio of violet-skinned Xanathians with elongated fingers perfect for precision cutting, sneered as they watched him set up. "I heard humans still cook their food over open flame," one of them snickered. "How primitive." Another, a bulky Trivan with armored plating, leaned in. "I bet he doesn't even know what a flavor weave is." James ignored them and focused on his setup. He had spent years studying alien culinary techniques, testing human adaptability against flavors that no one from Earth had ever encountered. He wasn't here to be intimidated. He was here to cook. Before he could get too comfortable, a loud chime signaled the arrival of Chef Gorath, who stepped onto an elevated platform overlooking the students. "Welcome, new initiates," he announced, his voice amplified by the Academy's intercom system. "You are here because you claim to be the best. Most of you will fail." His mandibles twitched in something resembling amusement. "Some of you will burn, poison, or explode your own kitchens before the week is over. And a select few will prove worthy of my time." He waved a clawed hand, and several drones descended, depositing a tray of ingredients onto each workstation. "Your first challenge begins now," Gorath continued. "Prepare a dish using the ingredients before you. No instructions, no guidance. You have 1 hour." James glanced down at his tray. Strange, wrinkled fruits oozed a bioluminescent gel. A bundle of what looked like living noodles squirmed slightly when he touched them. A metallic-looking spice sat in a sealed container, its label marked with a cautionary symbol. The other students immediately set to work, some slicing, others chemically neutralizing potentially hazardous components. James, however, took his time. He picked up the wrinkled fruit, sniffed it, then tasted a small bit of the gel. Sweet, with a hint of acidity, almost like passion fruit. The living noodles recoiled at his touch, but after a moment, he realized they reacted to heat. Carefully, he adjusted the temperature of his station, and the noodles relaxed, becoming pliable and soft. While others hesitated or second-guessed their methods, James cooked with instinct and precision. He roasted the fruit to enhance its caramelized flavors, creating a reduction with the metallic spice that gave it a smoky undertone. He gently folded the heat-treated noodles into a delicate, savory broth, balancing the unfamiliar flavors with techniques honed from human traditions. As time ran out, the students stepped back from their stations. Gorath and a panel of judges moved through the room, sampling each dish. The Xanathians had created an elegant but safe dish, masking strong flavors rather than enhancing them. The Trivan had overcomplicated his dish, adding too many competing elements. When they arrived at James's station, Gorath hesitated, his mandibles clicking thoughtfully. He picked up a sample with his secondary arms, bringing it to his mouth. The moment the flavors hit his palate, his eyes dilated. His mandibles twitched again, but this time, there was no disdain, only intrigue. He set the sample down, exhaled slowly, then turned to James. "Unexpected," was all he said before moving on. The room was silent. The other students stared, some in shock, others in growing concern. James simply smiled and leaned against his station, arms crossed. He wasn't here just to compete. He was here to win.
The kitchens of the Galactic Culinary Academy roared with activity as the next challenge was announced. The students, now slightly more accustomed to their surroundings, moved with urgency as they gathered their ingredients. Steam vents hissed, knives clattered against cutting boards, and the hum of advanced cooking machinery filled the air. James Carter, the lone human among them, stood at his workstation, arms crossed as he listened to Chef's latest instructions. "Today, you will craft a dish capable of evoking the strongest emotions," the head instructor declared. "Joy, nostalgia, sorrow, whatever you choose, your food must reach the very soul of the one who consumes it. If it does not, you have already failed." The moment the challenge was issued, the other students rushed to their ingredient stations, grabbing exotic components from refrigerated chambers and steaming vats of fermenting concoctions. Some worked with intense focus, using their species' natural talents to prepare intricate flavor infusions. The, known for their delicate manipulation of microscopic seasonings, began extracting molecules from rare spices to engineer precise emotional triggers. James, however, stood still. He watched. He analyzed. His mind wasn't racing to find the most advanced technique or rarest ingredient. He was thinking about what food meant beyond taste. He understood that flavor wasn't just chemical. It was memory, it was comfort, it was home. And then, an idea struck him. A small smile curled at the edge of his lips as he moved toward the storage area. The others barely spared him a glance, too busy perfecting their own strategies. He browsed through the Academy's vast inventory, past shimmering alien fruits and herbs, until he found exactly what he needed. The ingredients were unassuming compared to the radiant, glowing, and often sentient foods around them. Simple grains, butter, a few choice herbs, and a protein source. The kind of ingredients that, across every culture, could create a meal that was more than just sustenance. He returned to his station and set to work. His hands moved instinctively, muscle memory guiding each motion. He roasted the grains until they gave off a nutty aroma, then gently folded them into a bubbling broth infused with carefully balanced spices. The protein, carefully marinated in a reduction made from one of the few ingredients familiar to humans, sizzled as it hit the pan. The scent that filled the kitchen was unlike anything the Academy had experienced before. It wasn't aggressive or overwhelming like some of the more chemically enhanced dishes of the other students. It was warm, inviting. It smelled like home. James noticed movement from the corner of his eye. Some of the other students had started to slow down, their focus briefly breaking as they caught the scent wafting from his station. Even Chef, usually indifferent until judging, twitched slightly as his sensory receptors detected the unfamiliar yet deeply compelling aroma. James didn't answer. He simply plated his dish, carefully placing each component with purpose. A spoonful of his creamy grain dish, topped with the protein, drizzled lightly with an aromatic reduction. It was humble. It wasn't flashy. But it didn't need to be. The timer rang, and the judges began their rounds. As expected, the other students presented dishes that glowed, vibrated, or even changed states. Some caused involuntary reactions. When dish made a judge briefly weep, another caused an odd sensation of floating. Then they reached James. Chef picked up a spoon and scooped a bite of the grain dish, his mandibles clicking as he inspected it. Then, without hesitation, he ate. The moment the food hit his palate, a visible change came over him. His posture relaxed slightly, His secondary arms ceased their restless movements. His normally rigid demeanor softened, just for a fraction of a second. The other judges followed, each experiencing a different reaction. One of them, a cold and logical, let out a long, slow exhale, eyes briefly and focused as though recalling a memory long buried. Another, a hardened warrior species who had likely never known peace, let out an involuntary hum of satisfaction. The room was silent. Chef slowly set down his spoon and looked at James. "Explain." James wiped his hands on his apron, unfazed by the scrutiny. "It's a simple dish," he admitted. "But it's one that almost every species in the galaxy has a version of. A meal that reminds them of home, of family, of comfort. Not every powerful emotion is about intensity. Sometimes, the strongest emotions come from the things that make us feel safe." The silence stretched, but it wasn't hostile. It was contemplative. Then, Chef did something no one expected. He nodded. "Acceptable," he said simply, before moving on. But as he turned, there was something in his posture that suggested more than begrudging acknowledgement. There was understanding. James let out a breath and looked around. The other students were still staring, some in confusion, others in frustration. They seemed particularly disturbed that their precisely engineered techniques had been upstaged by something so basic. As the challenge ended, murmurs filled the room. James had done more than just prove humans could compete. He had changed the way some of them thought about food. And this was only the beginning.
The tension in the Galactic Culinary Academy's grand dining hall was thick enough to slice with a knife. It was the final challenge of the cycle, and the stakes were higher than ever. Every student who had made it this far knew that today's meal would determine their future, not just as chefs, but as potential culinary legends. The judges sat in their ornate observation seats, their many eyes, mandibles, and sensory tendrils trained on the contestants below. The challenge was deceptively simple. Create a dish that defines your species. The alien students around James Carter moved with precision, gathering the most exotic ingredients their homeworlds had to offer. The Trivarn, with their powerful exoskeletal arms, delicately handled razor-thin slices of protein harvested from the oceans of their planet. The Zelvari, masters of molecular gastronomy, manipulated gravitational fields to levitate microspices into swirling, colorful patterns of edible art. The reptilian Drovok used bio-enhanced fire pits to char their meat to perfection, releasing bursts of scent designed to trigger primal hunger responses. James stood at his station, watching them for a moment before exhaling and rolling his shoulders. He wasn't here to impress them with spectacle. He was here to prove a point. With a calm determination, he reached for his ingredients. Unlike the others, who had selected rare and valuable components, James had opted for something simple. Familiar. Humble. He lit his stove and set a heavy cast-iron pan on top. The sizzle of butter melting against the heated surface was almost lost in the chaos of the other stations, but those closest to him twitched slightly at the unfamiliar aroma. He worked quickly, efficiently, his hands moving with the ease of years spent cooking in tiny, bustling kitchens. He wasn't crafting an elaborate, gravity-defying creation. He wasn't engineering chemical reactions that played tricks on the senses. He was making a sandwich. A few students glanced his way, then immediately dismissed him. A sandwich? That was no challenge. It was barely even a meal. They focused on their own work, convinced that whatever primitive human dish he was making would be irrelevant compared to their multi-layered, meticulously crafted works of culinary art. James didn't care. He wasn't making food to impress the elite. He was making food that mattered. He grilled the bread to golden perfection, the scent of toasted grains mixing with the richness of the butter. He cooked the meat just right, perfectly seasoned, sizzling, the fat rendering into something that would melt on the tongue. He sliced fresh vegetables, crisp and vibrant, balancing texture and flavor. Every element of the sandwich was chosen with purpose, a balance of simplicity and perfection. Then, finally, he plated it. No extravagant garnishes, no glowing sauces, or molecular restructuring. Just a sandwich, cut cleanly in half, the layers visible, the warmth of the freshly grilled bread sending waves of familiar comfort into the air. The time was up. The judges began their rounds. One by one, they sampled the dishes presented by the other students. The Trivarn's ocean delicacies elicited murmurs of approval,
The Zelvari's flavor sculptures left the judges mesmerized. Then they reached James. There was a pause. A silence. Then, a sound that had never been heard before in the history of the Academy. One of the judges, a Yelvari with an elongated, translucent head, let out a skeptical snort. "A sandwich?" it questioned, its voice resonating telepathically. James smiled, folding his arms. "Yeah, try it." The Yelvari hesitated, then delicately picked up one half of the sandwich with its elongated fingers. Its compound eyes analyzed the food, searching for hidden complexities. Then finally it took a bite. The reaction was instant. The Yelvari's entire body stiffened, its four arms locking in place as its brain processed something it had never experienced before. The flavors weren't aggressive, they weren't engineered for intensity, but they were perfect. The crunch of the toasted bread, the savory burst of the seasoned meat, the refreshing crispness of the vegetables, the tangy hint of sauce. It was balance, it was harmony. It was a dish that didn't try to overpower the senses, but instead embraced them, comforted them. The other judges watched, their curiosity piqued. They each took a bite. The reptilian Drovak judge let out a slow, rattling exhale, his sharp teeth clicking against each other as he chewed. The Zelvari, known for their inability to express emotion, actually paused mid-bite, their normally neutral bioluminescent skin pulsing in slow, rhythmic waves, pure satisfaction. The Trivarn, who had mocked James earlier in the competition, grumbled under his breath as he took another bite, unwilling to admit that he was enjoying something so basic. Chef Gorath, the head of the academy, took his time chewing. He studied James with unreadable eyes before setting down what remained of his sandwich. "Explain." James wiped his hands on a cloth. "It's not about complexity. It's not about rare ingredients or fancy techniques. It's about balance. It's about taking something familiar, something anyone can enjoy, and making it perfect. It's about the experience of eating, not just the taste, but the feeling it gives you. Humans don't just eat food to survive. We eat to remember. We eat to share. We eat to feel good." The room was silent. Then, Chef Gorath did something no one expected. He nodded. The students around James looked stunned. The Trivarn muttered a curse. The Yelvari judge, still holding the sandwich half-eaten, blinked slowly, as if processing an existential revelation. James grinned. He had come here to prove a point. And judging by the stunned expressions around him, he had done exactly that.
The Grand Hall of the Galactic Culinary Academy was in absolute chaos. It had been weeks since James Carter, the human chef, had stunned the judges with nothing more than a perfectly made sandwich, and in that time, the entire academy had been turned upside down. What had once been a bastion of high art and molecular gastronomy, where every dish was a marvel of science and precision, was now struggling to comprehend an entirely new paradigm. Food that wasn't just impressive but satisfying. James stood in the middle of the kitchen arena, watching the madness unfold. The Trivarn students, once so smug in their knowledge of intricate seafood preparations, were desperately trying to master the simple art of seasoning. A Zelvari chef, whose entire career had revolved around deconstructing and reassembling ingredients into gravity-defying spirals, was staring in frustration at a basic pan, unable to understand how humans had perfected something as straightforward as frying. Even the Drovak, the fiercest and most aggressive species in the academy, had abandoned their tradition of flame-roasted meats in favor of something bafflingly new: slow cooking. James grinned as he flipped a pancake onto a plate, the simple pleasure of watching the golden-brown surface land perfectly giving him more joy than any of the overly complicated presentations he had seen before. Around him, the academy's finest chefs struggled with their own versions of human food. He heard the sharp sound of a Trivarn cursing as he burned yet another batch of eggs. A Zelvari scientist was meticulously measuring out ingredients for a human-style stew, trying to quantify a pinch of salt as if it were some ancient lost mathematical equation. "You've ruined everything, human," one of the instructors growled as they stormed past James, holding a shaking bowl of what was supposed to be mashed potatoes but had somehow turned into an unholy gelatinous mass. "You've made a mockery of our traditions." James just smiled. "Nah. I just reminded you why people eat food in the first place." The truth was, the academy had been too focused on spectacle. Sure, molecular breakdowns and gravity-assisted plating were impressive, but at the end of the day, food wasn't supposed to be just an art form, it was comfort. It was home. It was something that brought people together. And after seeing the stunned expressions of the judges after eating his sandwich, James had known exactly what his next mission would be. So, He had started teaching. At first, they had scoffed at him. What could a human possibly offer the most prestigious culinary institute in the galaxy? But then they had tasted his soups, rich, hearty, filling. They had bitten into his roasted meats, tender and flavorful. They had tried his desserts, warm, sugary, and nostalgic. And little by little, their resistance had crumbled. Now, the Academy students were no longer concerned with stacking their food into impossible towers or making it glow under ultraviolet light. They were learning about gravy, about marination, about the simple power of butter melting on fresh bread. "I don't understand," one of the Zelvari students groaned, clutching their head in frustration. "Your species has never even been at the top of the galactic food chain. How did you manage to evolve such ridiculously good culinary instincts?" James smirked. "Because humans had to figure out how to make food taste good even when we had nothing. You all grew up with perfect environments, endless oceans, nutrient-rich soil, planets designed for your species to thrive. Humans, we came from a death world. We had to work for every bite of food we got. We had to make roots and leaves taste good. We had to hunt things that were hunting us. Our survival depended on making the most out of the worst ingredients. And we didn't just eat food to live, we built entire cultures around it." The Zelvari student looked down at their ruined soup, then back at James with something bordering on awe. "You mean, cooking isn't just science to you? It's history?" James wiped his hands on his apron and leaned against the counter. "Yeah. Every dish tells a story. You want to cook like a human? Stop thinking about formulas. Start thinking about why the food matters." That single realization sent another shockwave through the academy. Within days, students abandoned their obsession with pure technical perfection and started experimenting with human techniques. Trivarn students tried their hand at slow-cooked stews, letting flavors develop over hours instead of seconds. Drovok warriors, once proud of their scorching flame-based cooking, began using low, smoldering heat to create perfectly smoked meats. The Zelvari, who had once believed that cooking was all about molecular precision, started making human-inspired comfort food, biscuits, dumplings, soups, and stews. The judges, still reeling from the revolution happening within their hallowed halls, could do nothing but watch as the entire academy shifted into something new. Some resisted, horrified by the idea of cooking something as basic as grilled cheese or braised short ribs. But others embraced it. One night, James found himself sitting in the academy's massive dining hall, watching as aliens from dozens of species sat together at long tables, sharing meals they had never even imagined before. Laughter echoed through the halls. Rival species, ones that had once refused to even sit near each other, bonded over discovering new flavors. Trivarns passed around bowls of mashed potatoes. Drovoks bickered over who made the best barbecue. The Zelvari were obsessed with pancakes. And in that moment, James realized something incredible. Humans had never been the strongest species in the galaxy. They weren't the fastest, the biggest, or the most technologically advanced. But they had culture. They had history. And they had a way of taking something as simple as a meal and turning it into a moment that could bring an entire galaxy together. James leaned back in his chair, taking a bite of the best burger he had ever made. He had done what no human had done before. He had conquered an alien world.